Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about and installing the tools needed to get started in web development. One of the great things about web development is that there are very few tools needed to actually get started, and all of them can be obtained for free. The tools that we're going to download today are web browsers. Typically I use Google Chrome for all of my development and testing. An integrated development environment, or an IDE, which is basically just a really fancy notepad. It's a tool that you use to write your code. Think of Word is for writing letters and Office documents. Excel is for spreadsheets. An IDE is for writing code. It has lots of tools that enable you to write better code, faster, and easier. We'll also want to install NodeJS, which is an engine that runs our code. And we'll also want to install Git, a version control system. This allows us to keep track of changes in our projects and time travel through our code. When we get started, there's not very much use for it because we'll be using a lot of one-off projects, but as we get into larger and more complex projects, Git is going to be a huge time and lifesaver for us. It is also useful when collaborating with teams, as we'll see later. The last thing that we'll want to get is a command line interface, which actually comes with Git. A command line interface allows us to run commands by typing them out rather than using Windows. At first, they're a little bit complicated and some are very unintuitive to use, but as you get used to them, you'll find that it's much easier and faster to run commands through a command line interface than using a mouse to point and click through a window-based program. So let's get started on installing each of these. For web browsers, again, I use Google Chrome. I find that the easiest to use for development. There will be links to all of these down below. I also have other web browsers installed so that I can verify that what I write works in all major web browsers. So not only do I have Chrome installed, but I also have Internet Explorer, Microsoft Edge, Firefox, Safari, Opera. All of these are great because even though you may not be using them, your customers or your users might. And it's good to make sure that what you are building works for all major browsers so that we don't have to worry about pushing something that works well for one browser and breaks completely in another. We'll also want to download an integrated development environment, an IDE. For me personally, I prefer Visual Studio Code. There are many other IDEs out there, some of which are available for free, some of which are premium, some have trial versions. There's many to choose from, and it's really a personal choice of what works best for you in your workflow. If you want to follow along with my videos and my projects, I recommend starting with Visual Studio Code so that you can see exactly what I see, and then move on from there and see if you prefer something else. So here's Visual Studio Code, code.visualstudio.com. It should automatically detect which operating system you're using. And so here it's saying download for Windows, stable build. Go ahead and do that. And it should have an automatic download. It should automatically download. Once it's downloaded, we just go through the basic installation. There's nothing super interesting here. Just go ahead and choose all the defaults. It asks if you want to have a start menu option. Here, the main thing you want to make sure is add to path is checked. I'm also going to check the register code as an editor for supported file types. That way I can just double click on a file and it will open in Visual Studio Code for me. Once you're done, just hit install and it will install for us. And once it's done, we can go ahead and launch. All right, here's the initial startup screen for Visual Studio Code. You can decide if you want to opt into data collection usage or not. I'm just going to go ahead and close out of there. But what we'll want to do is install support for JavaScript. The window will reload after installing additional support for JavaScript. Okay. There we go. And that's really all we need to do for here. As we get further into the series, we'll have to install a few more things, but for now, having support for JavaScript is all we're going to really need for this one. Next, we're going to want to install NodeJS, which you can get at nodejs.org. you will have two options when you land here of whether you want to get the LTS version or the current version. It's a little bit confusing, but you're going to want to choose the LTS option because that is the one that comes with lifetime support. It's a more stable version. And unless you're wanting to use the latest and greatest features, LTS is going to work for most. And it's going to be more stable. It's going to treat you the best in the long run. Unless you have a specific reason for using the latest features, I'd always choose to go for LTS. So let's go ahead and click on LTS, and it will download. The NodeJS installation is also fairly simple. Accept the terms of the license agreement, choose where you want to get it installed. Again, you want to make sure that the add path is selected, choose next. I don't think at this point that we need to install the native modules. If we do need to do this in the future, we can do it. There's no harm in doing it now, but for now, I don't think that we need it, so we'll go ahead and skip it. With that, you just click install, and we're off to the races. And finally, we're going to want to install Git, which comes with Git and the command line interface git bash. You can get to here by going to git-scm.com and clicking on downloads. Choose your operating system. For us, it's Windows, and it should automatically start to download. So let's go ahead and install Git. Git has a few more options that are a little bit more important. So let's go ahead and walk through this. First, choose where you want to get it installed. For me, I've already had it installed previously, so it's going to come up with this exists. Do I want to install anyways? Yes, because it has been uninstalled. You have the option to choose if you want a desktop icon or not. You can check for updates, but you want to make sure that you have Git bash and Git GUI checked. Choose if you want to make a start menu folder or not. It's just a decision if you want to have it in your start menu or not. Next up, it is asking us to choose our default text editor for Git. By default, it's selecting Vim, which is a very confusing text editor if you're not used to it. I personally prefer to use Vim. It's something that I'm used to, but for this series, I'm going to go ahead and go with Visual Studio Code, just because it'll be easier for the newer users to get a handle on. So let's go ahead and choose that. I have noticed that sometimes when we choose Visual Studio, it doesn't give us the option to move forward. If we hit back, next, now it gives us the option to move forward again. Next up, it's asking us what we would like our default branch name to be. This, I would just go with let Git decide. Basically, it's saying, when we create a new project, what do we want to name the main version of our project? Historically, Git has gone with master. Some teams choose main, trunk, development. There's a lot of different things. It's basically, what would you like to name the main version of your code? You could call it version 1. You do whatever you'd like. For here, we're just going to go ahead and stay with master. Next up, it's asking us how we want to adjust our path environment. Basically, this is asking us how we want to access Git and how much permissions we want to give our command line. For most people, I would go with the recommended path. This is what we're going to do. The first option will allow Git only to be used from within the command line interface. The second will allow Git to be used from the command line interface and also from third-party software, such as Visual Studio Code. It will allow us to interact with Git within other tools. The last option will basically allow us to turn our command prompt into the equivalent of a Linux, Unix, Mac terminal. So it will override a lot of Windows utilities. So if you're used to using the Unix, Linux, Mac terminals, then go ahead and choose this. But for us, we're going to go ahead and stay with the recommended settings. It prevents us from accidentally overriding Windows commands. And it's just a slightly safer path if you don't know what you're doing here. Choosing the SSH executable is basically saying how do you want Git to communicate with servers. I would say use OpenSSH here. It works, and there's no need to download additional programs for us. Next up, choosing which SSL library. Use the OpenSSL. That's pretty common. Next up is configuring the line ending conversions. Basically what this means is Git is able to let us work with teams. And sometimes people on our teams may be using different computers. As we were talking about earlier, some may have Macs, Linux, Unix, whatever. When we make changes to our project, we want to make sure that our changes work for anyone on any computer. And that's what this first option does. It says, when we're working on our computer, on a Windows computer, we will see the files in Windows format. But when we actually push it to a server for others to look at and work with, we're going to do it in the unified Unix style. That way, if someone else is working on a Mac or Linux or whatever, they can pull our code and it's going to be in the format used for them. When we pull it, Git will automatically convert it into Windows style for us. And when we push it back up to the server, it will convert it back into the Linux. So basically this option lets us maintain usability for all people. So we're going to want to choose the checkout Windows style, commit Unix style line endings. Next, we want to configure the terminal emulator to use with Git bash, use min-tty, the default terminal. Next, we want to choose the default behavior of Git pull. We are going to be doing a whole series on Git, what it is, how to use it in the future. So for now, just go ahead and stay with the default, and we will explain what this one means in that series. Next, choose a credential helper. For now, I would just go with the new Git Credential Manager core. This shouldn't make much difference to you as a new user, so just go with the default and we can move forward. Extra options. Which features would you like to enable? Enable file system caching and enable symbolic links. I would just choose the first one. This is the default, and let's move forward. Enable experimental support for pseudo consoles. I am staying away from any experimental stuff in this series. If it's something you want to play with, feel free, but we're going to keep it deselected for now. With that, let's go ahead and get it installed. All right, once it's installed, we can go ahead and deselect view release notes, and let's go ahead and launch Git bash just to make sure everything is working the way we expected. So go ahead and click finished. And here we have our command line interface, or Git bash. As you can see, this is very similar to an old DOS terminal or a modern Linux or Mac terminal window. We are able to do simple commands like see what our working directory. We'll be going over this more in the future. But just to make sure everything is installed as we expected, we can go ahead and type node, which will start running our node interface. And let's go ahead and write our first line of code right now. If we type console.log hello world, and you can do it with either single or double quotes, and then end it with a semicolon. Once you hit this, if you did it all correctly, we should see hello world and undefined. Don't worry about the undefined, but you can see we are working and we are now starting to write our very first code. So to get out of Node, we can't do exit. We'll want to do Control C again to exit, and there we go. So congratulations, you have all the tools you needed to get started with web development. And in the next videos, we're going to start writing some actual code and see it in action. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.